The dust kicked up under their boots as the team ventured deeper into the desolate ruins of local ghost towns. Shadows draped over the old mining structures like shrouds, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. The faint metallic tang of blood still lingered. Clayton clicked on his personal recorder. Log entry. Searching near some abandoned ghost towns. Sign of activity, but no movement spotted yet. We're heading into the old mines to check for nests. There's definitely something off about this place. Varric led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. If they're anywhere, it'll be underground. Mines like this are perfect for hiding. Isolated, cold, out of reach from sunlight. Jenkins walked just behind, his voice a mix of nervous energy and fascination. These mines are deep. If there's a nest, it could go on for miles. We should be prepared for the worst. As they pressed on, the entrance to the mine loomed ahead, a gaping black maw in the earth, its rusted supports groaning in the wind. The darkness inside seemed to swallow their lights, pulling them down. Varric's voice echoed behind him. Stay close and keep your eyes peeled. There are reports of bodies down here. People who went missing in the area. Some were travelers, others, hikers who strayed too far. The team descended further, the air growing colder with every step. Damp walls glistened with a faint sheen, and the passage seemed to narrow the deeper they went. Clayton's heart thudded in his chest. Every distant drip of water and crunch of gravel echoed back at them. Then, there it was. Just off the side of the main shaft, a makeshift alcove where 3 bodies lay, half buried in the dirt. Their throats were slashed, their faces pale, and drawn with the unmistakable marks of vampiric feeding. Flies buzzed around, and the stench hit them like a physical force. Dr. Thomas's voice cracked as he stepped closer. These bodies, they've been dead for days, maybe longer. But look at the wounds. Some are still fresh. Jenkins covered his nose. Damn bloodsuckers must have kept them alive, feeding on them slowly before leaving them for dead. Just then, a faint rustling came from deeper within the shaft. Varric froze, signaling the others to be quiet. From the darkness emerged a figure, trembling and gaunt, covered in grime. It was a man, eyes wide with terror. His voice was hoarse and barely audible. Please, don't let them find me. They'll come back. Varric stepped forward, calm but authoritative. Who did this to you? How many are there? The survivor's gaze darted around, as if expecting something to lunge from the darkness at any moment. I saw them. A group of them. Vampires. More than a dozen at least. They come and go. Take people deeper into the tunnels. Some don't come back. The words sent chills through Clayton. He clicked on his recorder again. Log entry. Survivor found. Claims multiple vampires are operating in the tunnels, taking victims alive. This could mean a larger nest, or something worse. Jenkins glanced down the dark corridor. We're not gonna find anything good deeper in these mines, but we need to know how many more are in there. The team pushed on, each step into the darkness bringing a sense of mounting dread. The air seemed to thicken as the passage sloped downward, the walls closing in tighter. The faint scuffling sounds and whispers of the survivors' warnings hung in the background like the echoes of trapped souls. The darkness inside the mine pressed in around them, the air cold and stale, whispering with the echoes of their footsteps. The narrow beams of their flashlights danced over jagged stone walls, stirring the heavy shadows. The Alphas led the way, Varric's movements steady and controlled, his instincts on high alert. Behind them, Clayton's team followed, flashlights sweeping cautiously over the mine's rugged terrain. "Stay alert and keep your eyes open," Varric instructed, his voice a low growl that seemed to blend with the echoes around him. Clayton walked just behind Dr. Thomas, who kept glancing nervously over his shoulder at Dr. Lowe, who brought up the rear with Dr. Harris just ahead of him. The Alphas spread out slightly, their keen senses attuned to every faint noise, every shift in the air. The mines seemed endless, each turn and fork in the passageways revealing more darkness. The deeper they ventured, the colder it grew, and the unsettling sense of being watched pressed down on the group like a weight. It felt as if the darkness was closing in on them, tightening its grip. The tunnel they followed soon opened up into a small cavern where old mining equipment lay scattered. Rusted tools, broken carts, and even a splintered wooden support beam. As they carefully stepped inside, the air grew even more still, and the faint scent of something metallic lingered. "Everyone stay together," Varric ordered, scanning the cavern's far corners. "This place is full of blind spots." The group spread out slightly, checking the scattered equipment and the walls for any signs of recent activity. The beam from Clayton's flashlight swept over a rusted pickaxe, and he felt a prickling sensation run down his spine. Something about the silence didn't feel right, as if it was waiting to be shattered. It wasn't until they approached another narrow passage at the back of the cavern that Clayton noticed something was wrong. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Where's Dr. Lowe?" The others turned around. Their flashlight beams converged on an area where Dr. Lowe should have been standing. "Lowe!" Dr. Harris called out, her voice carrying an edge of panic. Silence responded, broken only by the slow drip of water somewhere deeper in the mine. "He was just behind us," Dr. Thomas said. Jenkins frowned, glancing back at Varric, whose eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. "Something's not right," Varric growled. Clayton retraced their steps, his flashlight beam flickering over the rough stone walls. As the light danced across the surfaces, a dark streak caught his eye. Blood smeared across the rock, trailing into one of the narrow side tunnels that branched off from the main path. "Over here," Clayton whispered, drawing the others' attention to the faint stain. "There's blood." All the Alphas immediately moved to the front, their expressions hardening. "It's fresh," one of the Alphas said, crouching down to inspect the smear. "And it's heading that way." He pointed down the narrow passage, where the darkness seemed even thicker, almost suffocating. Clayton's hand shook slightly as he pulled out his recorder and clicked it on. "Log entry. Dr. Lowe has gone missing. Blood found on the tunnel wall. We're investigating deeper. Something may have taken him." Just as he clicked the recorder off, a sound drifted through the passageway. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled along the cold stone floor. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing from deeper within the mine. The Alphas exchanged glances, and Varric motioned for the others to follow. "We're going after him," he said, his tone commanding. "Stay close and watch the rear. We're not alone down here." The narrow passage twisted and turned, each step taking them deeper into the suffocating darkness. The air grew colder, and with every breath, a sense of foreboding deepened. The tunnel finally opened into another small chamber, this one filled with old wooden crates and a collapsed mining shaft. Dr. Harris suddenly froze, her flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated a pale, gaunt figure slumped against one of the crates. A survivor. His eyes were wide with terror, and his clothes were torn, revealing deep scratches on his arms.
"Please, don't let them take me,"
the man rasped, his voice barely audible. Varric crouched down beside him, his gaze unwavering. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice softer but no less intense. The man's gaze darted to the shadows around him, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment.
"They took the others, dragged them into the dark,"
he whispered.
"And they'll come for us too."
The team shared a tense glance. Somewhere in the maze of tunnels, something lurked, and Dr. Lowe was now part of its hunt. The cold night air outside the mine hit them like a wave as they emerged from a mine shaft opening, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere underground. The sky above was pitch black, the stars veiled behind a heavy layer of cloud cover. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees, but otherwise, the world seemed unnervingly still. As they exited the mine, everyone scanned the area, searching for any further signs of Dr. Lowe's whereabouts. Varric and the other alphas fanned out, their senses tuned to pick up even the faintest trace. Jenkins stayed close to the scientists, his eyes darting between the dark tree line and the mine's entrance, keeping a watch for any potential threat. "Do you have anything?" Clayton asked Varric, his voice tense with urgency. Varric shook his head. "The scent is faint," he said, his tone low and grave. "It's scattered, like something trying to mask it, but it's still there." As they moved further from the mine, the faint outline of an abandoned building loomed in the darkness ahead. A decaying hotel. The once grand structure was now little more than a derelict skeleton, its windows shattered and the roof partially collapsed. Weeds and vines crawled up the sides, reclaiming the space long since left to rot. "Looks like a good place for vampires to lay low," Dr. Thomas muttered as they approached, his gaze shifting to the boarded-up entrance. "Or keep a prisoner." Clayton's flashlight swept over the cracked walls and the broken sign that hung loosely above the door, its letters faded and barely legible. "We should check inside," he said, reaching for his recorder. "Log update. We're nearing an abandoned hotel about a half a mile from the mine. It's past midnight now, so now day 2. We're following a faint trail, but Dr. Lowe's whereabouts are still unknown. We're hoping this place will give us a clue." As the team cautiously approached the front steps, Varric raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. "We're at a dead end," he said, his nostrils flaring slightly as he took in a deep breath. "The scent is stronger here, but it's still not enough. We need to transform to pick up the trail properly." The other alphas exchanged a brief glance, each one nodding in silent agreement. "Are you sure?" Jenkins asked. "If there's any chance those vamps are still inside, we'll need you ready to fight, not shifting." Varric's expression hardened, and he shook his head. "We'll be no good if we can't track him. The transformation will heighten our senses beyond what they can mask. We need to be at our strongest." Jenkins gave a reluctant nod, turning to the rest of the team. Clayton and the others moved back to a safe distance, watching as the alphas stepped away from the hotel, heading around the side where a row of dense trees provided cover. The transformation, as they learned, was a private matter for the alphas, something done in seclusion, away from prying eyes. The minutes ticked by as the darkness deepened. Clayton found himself pacing, the tension in the air palpable. His thoughts raced, filled with worst-case scenarios as he replayed the last moments he'd seen Dr. Lowe. The sudden realization that he'd been gone, the blood streak on the wall. He gripped his recorder and clicked it on again, letting his voice cut through the silence. Log entry. The alphas are preparing to transform to pick up Dr. Lowe's trail. We're losing time fast. There's still no sign of him. It's too quiet. Moments later, Varric emerged from the shadows, his form altered, his eyes glinting in the darkness. The other alphas followed, their now wolfish shapes moving with lethal grace. Their senses were heightened, even sound and scent amplified tenfold. Varric padded over to Jenkins, his growl reverberating through the air. "The scent is clear now," his eyes darting to the hotel. "They've been here recently, and there are more than just a few of them." As Varric turned and began leading the way toward the back entrance of the hotel, the rest of the team followed, the darkness and silence broken only by the low growls and the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. The alphas moved ahead, their senses attuned to the faintest vibrations, sniffing out any signs of their missing team member. The abandoned hotel seemed to exhale a cold breath as they approached, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring into the night. The team moved quickly and silently, the dark, dilapidated halls of the hotel stretching out before them like a maw ready to swallow them whole. Darius took the lead, his half-vampire senses guiding the way, while Varric and the rest of the alphas followed closely behind, their eyes already glowing faintly as they approached the abandoned structure. Clayton, Dr. Harris, Dr. Thomas, and Jenkins formed a defensive line behind them, weapons ready, prepared to assist, but knowing this assault was out of their league. The signal came, a subtle gesture from Varric, and the alphas surged forward in a coordinated strike. They crashed into the first group of vampires like a tidal wave. The blitzkrieg was on. Claws, fangs, and silver-edged blades flashed in the dark as vampires were torn apart before they could mount any kind of defense. It was a feral blur of violence. The alphas didn't just fight, they dominated, their movements seamless and lethal. Darius was right in the thick of it, moving with a supernatural grace, his strikes precise and devastating. He drove his fist through the chest of one vampire, twisting savagely to rip out its heart, while using the momentum to spin and slash another across the throat with his silver dagger. The screams and snarls of the undead echoed through the decayed building, bouncing off the peeling walls and shattered windows, as dust swirled in the air from the ferocity of the battle. Clayton's team kept their position, covering the exits to ensure none of the vampires could escape. Dr. Harris caught sight of a shadow darting toward one of the broken side doors and quickly raised her rifle. A loud crack echoed in the hall as her shot hit home, dropping the fleeing vampire before it could disappear into the darkness. As the melee raged on, the alphas pushed deeper into the hotel, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. The vampire's resistance crumbled quickly under the assault. These lower-level bloodsuckers stood no chance against the ferocity of a werewolf squad in full hunt mode, backed by a half-vampire agent who seemed to take a dark pleasure in carving a path through his own kind. When the final vampire fell, whimpering and hissing on the ground, Varric grabbed it by the throat, lifting the emaciated creature effortlessly off the floor. The vampire's eyes were wide with terror, its pale face streaked with dirt and dried blood. "Now," Varric growled, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to tell us everything you know, or I'll let Darius finish what he started." Darius stepped forward, his silver dagger still dripping with dark blood, his gaze fixed intently on the captured vampire. There was no need for words. The threat was clear. The vampire trembled and began to speak in broken sentences, spilling what little it knew about Dr. Lowe's whereabouts and the Nest's plan. According to their captive, Lowe had been taken as bait to lure more fresh blood into a trap. They had hidden him somewhere in the deeper tunnels, but there was also talk of an underground chamber that few outsiders ever saw, rumored to be the lair of an older, more dangerous vampire that even the lower ranks feared. The alphas exchanged glances, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, as they considered their next move. It was clear the hunt was far from over. The team made their way back into the labyrinthian tunnels of the mine, the stale air thick with dust and a sense of foreboding. Their footsteps echoed in the darkness as they descended deeper, the lights from their helmets casting long shadows on the uneven walls. With each step, the passage grew colder, and the ground became more uneven, as if warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back. Not while Dr. Lowe was still out there. Clayton lagged behind for a moment, taking out his personal recorder. He glanced around to make sure he wasn't being watched, then clicked it on and whispered into the device, his voice barely audible over the distant drip of water from somewhere in the depths. Log update. Time around 2 a.m. We're back in the mines. The Alpha secured some intel from a surviving vampire at the hotel. There's supposedly an underground chamber where Dr. Lowe is being held. It could be another trap. It probably is a trap. But we don't have any other leads. Lowe's been missing for almost 4 hours now. The longer he stays in their hands, the less likely we'll find him alive. Or, he hesitated, his voice faltering. Unchanged. He took a deep breath before continuing. Varric's leading the way. The guy moves like he's been down here 100 times. The Alphas haven't shown any sign of fatigue. And Darius, well, he's on edge. He seems almost too eager to finish off more of his kind. Can't blame him, I guess. But this whole thing feels off. Like there's something we're not seeing. Gotta keep my head on a swivel. Clayton switched off the recorder, slipped it back into his pocket, and hurried to catch up with the others. They were moving in formation, Varric and the Alphas at the front, Darius keeping a steady pace, his senses heightened. Dr. Harris and Dr. Thomas followed close behind, their nerves visible in the way they gripped their weapons. Jenkins brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel branched off into smaller, darker corridors. Every now and then, they passed what looked like discarded clothes or old equipment left behind by previous explorers, or victims. Clayton could feel the tension mounting, the oppressive weight of the earth above pressing in on them. Darius paused, lifting a hand to signal the group to stop. "We're close," he whispered. "I can smell the blood. It's stronger here." The Alphas shifted, their expressions hardening, their eyes glowing faintly as the beast within them stirred. Varric's voice was a low rumble. "Stay alert. They'll know we're coming." They continued down the narrow path until they reached a larger chamber. The cavern opened up before them, revealing jagged stalactites hanging from the ceiling like fangs. In the middle of the chamber was a large stone altar surrounded by a scattered ring of bones and debris. Faint whispers echoed through the chamber, as though the very walls were haunted by the voices of the lost. "We're in the right place," Varric said, his voice reverberating in the cavern. "But the real question is, where's Dr. Lowe?" The chamber erupted into chaos the moment they stepped inside. From the shadows, a swarm of vampires descended upon the team, their eyes gleaming with feral hunger and their fangs bared. The Alphas wasted no time. Varric gave a guttural growl, and his team shifted into action with lethal precision. Their movements a blur as they tore into the attackers. Darius leaped into the fray with a snarl, his half-vampire instinct sharpening his reflexes and driving him into a frenzy of violence. Clayton and the rest of the team moved to form a defensive perimeter. Jenkins fired off controlled bursts with his rifle, each shot landing with deadly accuracy. Dr. Harris and Dr. Thomas stuck close to the rear, taking aim at any vampires that broke through the melee. The stench of blood filled the cavern, mingling with the ear-piercing screeches of dying vampires and the sound of bones snapping under the weight of the Alpha's assault. Amidst the chaos, Clayton's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for any sign of Dr. Lowe. He spotted him near the far wall, barely conscious and slumped over a jagged rock. Relief flooded him for a moment, but then he noticed the figure standing over Dr. Lowe. A tall, gaunt vampire with a twisted smile and dark, ancient eyes. The leader.
Over there!
Clayton shouted, pointing toward Dr. Lowe.
We need to get him out now!
The vampire leader's gaze snapped towards Clayton, and his smile widened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. With an almost lazy motion, he grabbed Dr. Lowe by the collar and began dragging him toward the narrow passageway at the back of the cavern. Varric saw this, and his eyes burned with a dangerous intensity.
Cover me!
He roared to his pack and lunged forward, his claws outstretched. The Alphas moved in unison, slamming into the remaining vampires with renewed ferocity. It was just as they had planned, tearing through their enemies in a whirlwind of claws, fangs, and gunfire. But for every vampire that fell, 2 or more seemed to emerge from the darkness. They were being overwhelmed. Clayton fired his rifle at the vampires converging into Dr. Lowe, but the leader was already slipping into the darkened passage, dragging Dr. Lowe out of sight.
He's getting away!
Clayton shouted, desperation clawing at his voice. He broke away from the defensive line, sprinting toward the passage, but several vampires lunged to intercept him. Jenkins was beside him in an instant, knocking one vampire to the ground with the butt of his rifle and unloading rounds into another's chest.
Stay with the group, Clayton!
He shouted, shoving him back into position.
We can't risk you getting grabbed too!
The battle raged on, and Varric tore through the vampires with reckless fury, trying to reach the passage where Dr. Lowe had been taken. But for every step forward, more of the undead leapt in his way, forcing him to fight his way through. The leader's mocking laughter echoed from the dark as he disappeared deeper into the mine, dragging his prize with him. In the midst of the melee, Darius let out a growl and flung himself towards the passage, tearing a vampire in half to clear the path.
I'll go after him!
He yelled, but Varric pulled him back.
No, Darius. We regroup and plan. We can't afford to be split up.
Reluctantly, Darius retreated to the defensive line, his frustration evident. With the leader and Dr. Lowe gone, the remaining vampires seemed to lose their coordination, breaking away and retreating deeper into the darkness. The Alphas gave chase for a few paces, but then halted, returning to the others. Clayton's chest heaved with exhaustion and anger.
He was right there,
he said, his voice hoarse.
We almost had him!
Varric wiped the blood from his claws, his expression grim.
Almost isn't enough. We'll get him back, but we need to regroup and find out where that passage leads.
He glanced at the remaining bodies scattered across the chamber, some of them twitching in their final moments.
We'll make one of them talk.
The atmosphere in the cavern grew tense and quiet. The remaining vampires, now battered and bloodied, lay scattered across the ground. A few still clung to life, but barely. Clayton's breathing was ragged as he stood over one of them, rifle aimed square at its chest.
Where did they take him?
He demanded, voice seething with urgency. The vampire let out a choked laugh, blood oozing from its mouth.
You're too late. Even if you reach him, you won't bring him back alive.
It looked up at Clayton with defiant eyes, and then drove one of its claws into its heart. The sound of flesh tearing was sudden and final. The vampire's eyes glazed over, its body going limp. Clayton cursed under his breath, as he turned to see the alphas interrogating another dying vampire a few feet away. The result was much the same. Its grotesque laughter echoing in the cavern as it chose death rather than revealing any useful information. The situation was growing dire, and time was slipping away. A sudden vibration from his belt startled him, and Clayton glanced down to see the frequency display flickering. It was locking onto something, an indication that their return path was starting to stabilize. They were getting closer to the gate frequency, but the belt needed more time to fully lock on. "Clayton," Dr. Harris called out, jogging over to where he stood. "The belt, it's picking up on the home frequency. This means we're somewhere near the right coordinates, but not locked on just yet. We could still be hours away from it stabilizing enough for a safe return." Clayton gritted his teeth, a sinking feeling of dread forming in his chest. "We can't wait for it to lock in while Lowe is still missing," he said, frustration evident in his tone. He turned to Varric, who was pacing near the entrance of the cavern, deep in thought.
"We need to surface,"
Varric said finally, his gaze shifting to Clayton and the rest of the team.
"There could be other entrances or clues in the town above. The mine is too vast. We can't search every tunnel without knowing where we're heading. We're losing time."
Jenkins nodded in agreement, his expression stern.
"I don't like it, but it's our best shot. This place is a maze. If we stay down here, Lowe's as good as gone."
Darius wiped sweat from his brow, frustration written on his face.
"Fine, but we need to make it fast. If they've taken Lowe to some hidden lair, we're already playing catch-up."
A heated debate followed, with each member voicing concerns. Dr. Thomas insisted they scour the tunnels for even the smallest clue, while Jenkins argued the urgency of covering more ground on the surface. Varric's patience wore thin, and with a low growl, he cut through the argument.
"Enough! We're surfacing. We can regroup at the ghost town and pick up the trail from there."
The decision made, the group ascended from the dark, musty depths of the mine, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone. As they neared the surface, the air grew frigid, and the pale light of the moon washed over the broken remnants of the city of Rhyolite. The ghost town's skeletal remains loomed before them, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. It was a place that reeked of death and decay, its abandoned buildings standing like tombstones marking the past. The chill of the night bit through Clayton's jacket as they stepped into the open. He glanced at his belt. The frequency was still locking in, but the signal was stronger now. It was a small comfort in the midst of the uncertainty. Varric shifted his gaze across the town.
"Split up, search the buildings. Anything that looks like it could be a hideout or passage."
His voice was gruff, edged with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Clayton took a deep breath and reached for his recorder. He clicked it on and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Log update. We've surfaced at the Rhyolite ghost town. Dr. Lowe is still missing, and the trail is cold. The vampires won't talk, and my belt is starting to lock onto the return frequency, but it's not fully stable yet. We're racing against the clock now, and I don't know how much time we have left." He clicked off the recorder and exchanged a glance with Jenkins, who gave a brief nod before they split off to search the nearest building. As the group fanned out across the ghost town, Clayton felt the weight of dread growing heavier. Every second they spent chasing shadows brought them closer to losing Dr. Lowe for good. The air around them felt colder as the group spread out in the ghost town, their movements hurried and filled with tension. The Alphas, moving with purpose and precision, scoured the nearby buildings with Clayton's team searching for any signs of Dr. Lowe. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim glow over the cracked earth and skeletal remains of Rhyolite's abandoned structures. Clayton's belt buzzed again, a soft pulse signaling the frequency was nearing a full lock. He glanced down at the display, 93%, but the number brought him little comfort. They were running out of time, and the decision they had to make weighed heavily on his mind. Varric, standing at the edge of the ghost town, sniffed the air with his keen senses. The rest of the Alphas gathered around him, their expressions grim. Darius, beside Clayton, was tense, his half-vampire instincts flickering between caution and readiness.
"I've got something,"
Varric muttered, his voice low and gravelly.
It's faint, but it's there.
He pointed west, toward a jagged stretch of hills disappearing into the darkness.
They took Low that way, no doubt about it. But the trail's weak, fading.
Jenkins approached, wiping sweat from his brow.
"How far?"
Varric shook his head, frustration evident in his expression.
Hard to say. Could be half a mile. Could be 5. It's not close, but it's our only lead.
Dr. Harris, clutching her tablet, looked over at Clayton. And yet, her voice trailed off as she gestured to the belt around Clayton's waist. The gate frequency is locking in, almost fully. We're heading in the opposite direction. She pointed toward the south, where the belt had indicated their homeward path. If we go after Dr. Lowe, we might lose the chance to get back to the gate in time. A heavy silence settled over the group as the weight of the choice loomed large. Clayton could feel the tension like a thick fog creeping over them. Darius was the first to speak.
"If we don't go after him now, we might never find him."
His voice was sharp with urgency, but his gaze remained on the Alphas.
"Lowe's part of your team. We won't leave him behind."
Clayton felt his chest tighten. Darius wasn't wrong, but the reality of their situation was far more complicated. The belt's frequency lock was their lifeline. Without it, the chance of getting home alive decreased with every minute.
"If we go after Lowe,"
Jenkins said, his voice calm but firm,
"we risk missing our window for the gate. We'd be at the mercy of the home frequency snapping us back at random. No control, no coordination. We could end up anywhere. Or worse, dead."
Dr. Harris nodded grimly. "And if the frequency stabilizes fully before we reach him, we could be yanked back before we even find him. There's no telling where any of us might end up." The group stood in uneasy silence, the night's cold wind cutting through their clothes like a blade. Clayton turned his gaze west, toward the hills where Varric had picked up the trail. A faint part of him clung to the hope that Lowe was still alive, still within reach. But the numbers flashing on his belt told him another story. 94%, 95%. Clayton clenched his fists. Dr. Lowe's our teammate. We can't just abandon him. His voice was firm but laced with doubt. He looked at Varric, whose stoic expression betrayed nothing of the internal conflict Clayton knew he must be feeling. Varric growled softly, his yellow eyes gleaming under the moonlight.
"We find him, no matter what."
"But at what cost?"
Jenkins snapped at his group, his frustration finally boiling over.
"You want to risk getting stranded? Separated across who knows where in the home world? We'd lose more than Lowe if this goes south. The clock's ticking. And if that frequency stabilizes and we're not at the gate..."
"We can't just leave him," Dr. Thomas interrupted, his voice tightened with emotion. "We owe it to him." Clayton took a deep breath, his gaze darting between the group and his belt. 96%. The lock was almost complete. They were so close to getting home, but the thought of leaving Dr. Lowe behind gnawed at his conscience. "I won't leave him." Clayton's voice was soft but resolute. "If you want to head back to the gate, you can. But I won't be stepping through without knowing what happened to Dr. Lowe." The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension. The Alphas exchanged glances, each one silently processing the gravity of the situation. Varric's jaw clenched as he turned to the team.
We make this quick. We follow the trail. But if we lose it or hit a dead end, we turn back for the gate.
Jenkins exhaled, his frustration giving way to reluctant acceptance.
Fine, but we move fast.
Dr. Harris was visibly torn but nodded in agreement.
Let's move then. Time's not on our side.
Just as the group began to set off, Varric put a hand on Clayton's shoulder, his gaze firm and reassuring.
Don't worry,
he said in a low voice meant only for Clayton.
I'll find him, I promise. You need to turn around and go back.
Clayton nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. They were going to do everything in their power to bring Dr. Lowe back, no matter the cost. With the plan set, the teams split up. The Alphas moved west, following Varric's lead as he tracked the faint scent, with Darius following close behind, while Clayton's group reluctantly started toward the south, where the gate's frequency continued to stabilize. The choice weighed on them heavily as they walked, every step feeling like a gamble with fate. The night pressed in around them as the two groups ventured in opposite directions, hoping against hope that their paths would converge once again before it was too late. The night seemed darker than ever as Clayton's team trekked toward the gate location, each step filled with a mixture of urgency and dread. The cold air stung their faces as they pressed on, their footsteps echoing against the barren ground. Dr. Harris kept glancing at her watch, then back at the frequency monitor on Clayton's belt, her eyes filled with glowing anxiety. 98%, she murmured, the numbers flashing in a grim countdown toward their departure. We're almost out of time. Clayton lagged behind, his jaw clenched and fists balled tight. We should have gone after Lowe, he growled, his voice filled with frustration.
Damn it! We should have taken the chance.
Dr. Thomas reiterated. We don't know where they took him, he replied, though the words felt hollow even to him. If we didn't get to the gate in time, we'd be lost, scattered across the world. Clayton scoffed. At least we'd have tried. Instead, we're running like cowards while Lowe's still out there. Dr. Harris's voice was strained as she interrupted.
If we'd stayed and the frequency locked while we were out of range, we'd never find our way back. It's not just about us, it's the mission.
Well, that's convenient, Clayton shot back, sarcasm heavy in his tone. A mission to abandon our own.
Enough,
Jenkins said sharply, his tone final.
We know what our mission is, and we don't want to lose anyone else. We're going to the gate.
The air between them hung heavy with unresolved tension, but the bickering subsided as they neared the gate location. Clayton's belt buzzed again, 99%, and the numbers flickered steadily. They were almost there. The landscape grew rougher, jagged rocks and uneven ground slowing their pace. The portal site, located in a clearing just beyond a low ridge, was barely visible through the encroaching darkness. The silence around them grew thicker, the only sound their labored breathing as they climbed the last incline. Clayton could feel his chest tightening with each step. There was a finality to this moment that filled him with a bitter taste, as if every footfall was sealing Dr. Lowe's fate. At the top of the ridge, the belt gave a sudden, final buzz. 100%. This is it, Dr. Harris whispered, her voice wavering. She glanced back at Clayton, her expression pleading. We could give it a little more time. Maybe the Alphas will find something. No, Clayton said, his voice steady but laced with grief. Jenkins is right. We have to go now. We've already pushed it too close. He reached down, pressing the activation button on the belt. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until a shimmering portal opened up before them, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The sight of the portal should have brought relief, but all Clayton felt was a hollow ache. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The faces of his team reflecting the same mixture of anguish and resignation, each of them torn by the choice to leave their teammate behind. Jenkins let out a shaky breath.
If he makes it out, if the Alphas find him,
he'll find his way back, Dr. Thomas said. He has to. Clayton turned to face his team, his gaze steady. It's time. We have to go, he said. One by one, they moved toward the portal, the swirling vortex casting eerie shadows across their faces. Dr. Harris was the first to step through, her shoulders tense with unspoken sorrow. Jenkins followed, hesitated for the briefest moment before vanishing into the light. Finally, Clayton stood alone at the portal's edge. He took a deep breath, casting one last look back towards the hills in the distance, where the faint hope of rescuing Dr. Lowe still lingered. But that hope was dwindling, fading like the night as dawn crept nearer. He stepped forward, his vision blurring as he was engulfed by the swirling energy. The portal closed behind him with a muted hiss, leaving the dark landscape empty and still. On the other side, the transition was harsh and disorienting, the sudden change in temperature and air pressure hitting them all at once. Clayton stumbled out of the gate, the brightness of the sterile room blinding after the dim world they had just left behind. Dr. Chang was waiting for them, her expression one of grim acknowledgement as she took in the sight of the returning team. Her eyes scanned the group, and when she saw they were one less member than before, a flicker of sorrow crossed her face. Clayton took a deep breath, the weight of the decision to leave Dr. Lowe behind crashing down on him with full force. There were no words as he met Dr. Chang's gaze. No excuses, no explanations that could ease the guilt. The truth of their failure hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Report," Dr. Chang said quietly, but her tone left no room for delay. Clayton's voice was hoarse as he replied, "We couldn't find him. The Alphas, a group we were with, are still out there, searching." There was a moment of silence, thick with the tension of unspoken fears and regrets. Dr. Chang's face remained calm, but there was no mistaking the sadness in her eyes. "Let's debrief," she said softly, gesturing toward the corridor. "We'll determine our next steps. We're not giving up on him yet." As they walked away from the gate, the team's footsteps echoed hollowly in the sterile halls, each step a reminder of the unfinished battle still unfolding on the other side. The debriefing room was cold and sterile, the white walls casting a clinical sheen under the harsh fluorescent lights. Clayton and the others sat around the table, their expressions weary and tense. Dr. Chang stood at the head, her gaze locked on the team as she prepared to hear their account. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, her voice steady, though it carried an undercurrent of concern. "What happened after you encountered the vampires in the mines?" Clayton took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Dr. Harris and Jenkins before answering. "We found signs of a large vampire nest, but Dr. Lowe disappeared during the search. We must have taken him while we were distracted. The Alphas split up to track him down, but before he could finish, the door to the room burst open, and a medical officer hurried inside, holding a smartphone-like device. The interruption froze everyone in place. A murmur of confusion passed through the team. "Dr. Chang," the officer said, his voice urgent as he approached her. "You need to see this." He handed the device to Dr. Chang, who glanced down at the screen. Her brow furrowed as she stared at the GPS map displayed on the device. A red tracker marked Dr. Lowe, blinking steadily on the screen. The location was unmistakable. Bolivia, right at the Gateway of the Sun monolith. "What is this?" Dr. Chang asked, her tone sharp. "How did you get this tracking information?" "It came through just minutes ago, beeping in the medical room. It started tracking Dr. Lowe on its own. The signal is strong and stationary. He's definitely there." The tension in the room thickened as everyone processed the news. Jenkins' face twisted into a grimace, and Dr. Harris leaned forward, her eyes wide. Clayton's pulse quickened. The news brought a sliver of hope, but also a torrent of questions. "The Gateway of the Sun?" Clayton echoed with a frown. "That's nowhere near our original location. He got snapped back on the other end of the world, didn't he?" Dr. Chang took a step back, her gaze still fixed on the blinking dot on the map. "We don't know, but we're going to find out." She looked up at the officer and with a very serious look on her face and said, "Initiate snapback protocol and establish communication ASAP." Clayton responded quizzically, "What the hell is snapback protocol?" "Well, you know when one or more of us end up in this predicament? Our director had connections all over the world to ensure rapid extraction. No questions asked. It's our version of a backup to the gate. I guess Dr. Lowe had somewhat of the same idea with this device." Dr. Chang zoomed out on the device map and zoomed back in on Geneva. She nodded her head to see 4 more location trackers with names attached of the other members of the team. On seeing that, Jenkins searched his vest and found what is similar to an Apple AirTag sewn into the inner seam.
"Clever little bastard,"
he murmured. About a half hour later, Dr. Chang called everyone back into the briefing room with a conference call set up in the center. "Quick everyone, take a seat. Lowe's on the other line through a satellite phone." Dr. Chang quickly connected the call and placed the phone on speaker. "Dr. Lowe, can you hear us?" Her voice held a mixture of relief and urgency. A familiar voice crackled through the speaker. Strained but undeniably Dr. Lowe.
"Yeah, I hear ya,"
he groaned.
"Being snapped back really sucks, in case anyone was wondering. I ended up on top of the Gateway of the Sun, rolled off and hit the ground pretty hard, dislocating my shoulder, and I think I bruised a few ribs."
Clayton let out a low whistle. "You sure know how to make an entrance, Doc."
"Trust me, I wasn't trying to,"
Dr. Lowe replied, a faint hint of humor in his voice despite the pain.
"I'd rather take my chances with the gate any day."
Dr. Chang leaned in. "Dr. Lowe, we noticed a tracking device sewn into Jenkins' vest, and the other members of the team have them as well. What's the story behind that?" There was a slight pause before Dr. Lowe answered.
"Well, let's just say doctors have to be prepared for unexpected outcomes. I slipped those into the team's gear during routine checks. I figured if things ever went sideways, it might come in handy, especially in our line of work."
Jenkins chuckled.
"Clever little bastard. Can't say I'm surprised."
Clayton's tone grew more serious. "Do you have any idea what happened back there, Doc? Why you were taken? Or how they plan to use you?"
"I'm still piecing that together,"
Dr. Lowe replied, his voice grim.
"It wasn't just about feeding or intimidation. The vampires seem to have some sort of interest in our equipment, especially my medical gear. I think they were trying to figure out a way to replicate the gate's frequency mechanism. It felt like they wanted to understand how we move between worlds."
Dr. Chang's eyes widened, her thoughts racing. "That's valuable intel, Dr. Lowe. We need to debrief more thoroughly once you're back. Right now, the priority is getting you medical attention and bringing you back."
"Believe me, I'm all for that,"
Dr. Lowe agreed.
"I'm holding up
but I won't be running any marathons soon.
After the phone call with Dr. Lowe ended, Dr. Chang addressed the team. You've all been through a lot, and there's no immediate need for further action. Take the time to rest and recover. Dr. Lowe will be brought back as soon as possible, and I'll keep you updated on his progress. The group slowly dispersed, grateful for the reprieve. Clayton headed to his quarters, feeling the accumulated exhaustion finally catching up with him. The adrenaline that had sustained him for so long was ebbing away, leaving behind a dull ache in its wake. Portal Entry Report, Dr. Emily Chang. World Designation, World of Monsters, Tentative. Portal Frequency, 631 Hz. Classification, Zone Yellow. Dangerous cryptids with balanced cryptid control agencies. Assessment. Mark as Level 8 restricted frequency. Facility squad personnel only. Establish future contact with Portal World Agency and solidify connections. Special note. Implementing Dr. Lowe's tracking technology from now on. Requesting his salary raise and commendation award. A few days later, Dr. Lowe returned to the facility. Though physically on the mend, there was a haunting look in his eyes, a sign that his ordeal had left scars deeper than the visible bruises and bandages. After settling in, he requested a brief meeting with Clayton. In the medical room, now as a patient, Dr. Lowe sat across from Clayton, a tired but determined expression on his face. I heard you've already seen Dr. Schmidt, he began, his voice steady but laced with wariness. Clayton nodded. Yeah, I had a few sessions with him to work through everything. He's good at what he does. Helped me unpack a lot. Dr. Lowe sighed, leaning back on the bed. I've been thinking about seeing him myself. I know I need to talk to someone about what happened. The kidnapping, the vampires, the whole damn experience. It's not exactly easy to just brush it off. It's not, Clayton agreed, meeting Dr. Lowe's gaze. It's not easy at all, but it helps to talk it out. Schmidt will listen, and he doesn't push you to say more than you're ready for. He knows how to let you work through things at your own pace. Dr. Lowe's expression softened. That's good to know. I've been through rough missions before, but this, it was different. It felt more personal, more... He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Clayton gave him a reassuring nod. We all felt it. You went through hell, Doc, and no one expects you to just move on like nothing happened. Take the time you need. Dr. Lowe managed a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Clayton. I think I will. As Clayton left the medical room, he glanced back at Dr. Lowe, who was staring out the window. It was a reminder that even though they had survived, some battles continued long after the mission was over. In the darkest of unknowns, the strength to endure is not found in solitude, but in the bonds we forge. For when shadows close in, it's the struggle shared between us that guides the way forward. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad that this story was a two-parter, because one outing is just too long for anyone to listen to. So, with spooky season, it was nice to split this up into two parts. So let's talk about the AI. The first thing is that it was way too into describing how creepy and spooky the caves were. I think that was a little bit overkill, and I kind of dialed it back a little bit during editing. Another thing was character motivations. Near the end, that argument with Clayton and Jenkins, I had to flip the script near the end because it was supposed to be Clayton being sarcastic and angry near the gate, but
The AI had it as Jenkins, so I had to switch and flip the script a little bit on that one. That was a little bit strange. As always, I have the Buy Me a Coffee link. It is very appreciated. It's not expected, but I do appreciate a good coffee while I'm doing my recording and editing and everything, because I go through a lot of it during my sessions. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Like I always say, it's the lifeblood of my channel. And tell a friend about my stories. I love for them to hear them too. Oh, I'm not just on YouTube now, I'm also on Rumble. So go ahead and go over there and check me out there. These same stories are the same stories that are over there. And remember, it's okay to be scary. I am too. Embrace the weird, embrace the strange, embrace spooky season, and I will see you later.